So, all right, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Anna Greco. I'm the Director of Education, and it's a great pleasure that we are able to host tonight's speaker, Professor MacKethan. Just before we get started, I'm sure everyone has had a couple opportunities to use Zoom, but we are asking everyone to stay on mute during the lecture, and we do have the chat room available. So if you do have any questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to enter them into the chat. I know that Lucinda is looking very much forward to having a conversation with our participants and answering your questions. And I know from my exchanges with some of you in the audience that you have your own stories to share about Anya Seton, as well as your experiences growing up in Koskov and your familiarity with her story. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about a local Koskov residence. As many of you are aware, Anya Seton did grow up in Windagul, which is now Pomerantz Park, just down the street from the Greenwich Historical Society. Tonight's speaker, Professor Lucinda MacKethan, is quite an established career. She has served as chair of the North Carolina Humanities Council, a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. She did retire in 2008 after 37 years as director of the Creative Writing Program and Alumni Distinguished Professor of English at North Carolina State University. And she has a very distinguished career as an expert in Southern literature. And I know part of her story is how she became interested in Anya Seton and in her work. So I am going to hand over tonight's presentation to Lucinda MacKethan. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Anna, and I am delighted to be here. I wish I could be in Greenwich. I wish we could all be there together, but I'm just grateful there's something called Zoom so that I can share this book that has been out for about 1 month now, and especially to get feedback from you. So I am going to go through a few slides just to get us grounded a little bit in some of the ways that I have come to know Anya and that I know Greenwich as her home. And the first slide just simply shows you the writing family that Anya Seton belonged to. I guess that was one of the first things that struck me. I knew nothing about Anya Seton's life. As a reader of novels, I think like most of you, I read her novels, especially in my late high school years with my mother and my sister in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And we didn't care who Anya Seton was, and we didn't know who she was. I'm sure people around New York knew, and certainly people in Greenwich, but I think her readers throughout England and America and Europe had no idea really who she was in terms of most of her life. And so to discover the kind of family that she grew up in, the fact that she was the daughter of two very well-known writers in her own time, and the way their lives overlapped in so many interesting and unusual and unique and also powerful ways, that family of three. I actually, when I started, for a little while, toyed with the idea of writing a family biography of all the Setons, simply because it seemed to me they were worthy of that. The huge amount of material, to say nothing of the number of books that they all wrote, discouraged me pretty quickly. But it was to me an amazing fact, as I think it is to most people who have come to know her own literal story now, to see where she came from and who she came from. At age 17, she said, "I could write, I know, but I would rather live exciting things than write them for imaginary people." And one of the reasons she didn't want to write at that age was she watched her parents from the time she was a very little girl at Windagul writing all the time. And that occupation held no romance for her whatsoever. She wanted a much more exciting romantic life for herself. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide.
Usually ask if you want to go audio.
I want to begin, first of all,
back in again.
introducing you to
Options.
another family, which is the same family, the descendants of Anya Seton, and therefore, of course, of Grace and Ernest Thompson Seton. And the first slide shows you my introduction to the world of a real Anya Seton. Was her granddaughter Blythe Toussaint, who is the daughter of Pamela Forsey, who is the daughter of Anya Seton. The next slide shows you a little more, and another member of the family I want you to meet. This is Pam Forsey, the daughter of Anya Seton and the mother of Blythe Forsey Toussaint. Two pictures of her, one taken not long before she died, which was a great tragedy to me. She died in April of 2019 and had moved at that time out to Colorado to be near her daughter. But I knew her in Manhattan, and she was the most incredibly generous helpmate to me. In fact, had started herself to write her mother's biography, and had given up the idea, and so was very excited when Blythe let her know that I might be interested. When Blythe told me she was the granddaughter of Anya Seton and hoped herself to write a historical novel, I about dropped over, because Anya Seton was my favorite writer. In high school, Katherine was the only novel I took with me to college. And so to get to know Blythe, and then to get to know the daughter of Anya Seton, Pamela Forsey, was an amazing gift that started me on the road to writing this book. Okay, next slide, and we'll meet someone else in the family. This is Anya Seton's other daughter, the other wonderful person who has meant so much to me as I have worked on this book. This is Clemency Coggins, and Clemency is the younger daughter of Anya Seton by her second husband, Chan Chase, and there she is with Blythe at Searoon, the home where she grew up, and where she watched her mother write Katherine and the Winthrop Woman, and introduced me to so many of the stories about Anya and her life as a mother and a writer that I know now. Next slide. More of the family. This may not show up very largely, but this is the wonderful group of people who gathered last in June of 2019 to celebrate the life of Pamela Forsey. I was at that time about halfway through finishing the book, and this wonderful group gathered with me. On the left, at least as I see it, is Blythe's brother and Pamela Forsey's son, Peter, who with all these women became not only a chauffeur, but a guide, a director. When we were lost, he managed to get us through. He made all our arrangements. And he's just been a wonderful fellow to me, gotten me from Manhattan, where he lives part of the time, out to Greenwich many times. And also in that picture on the right is Blythe, and next to her is Clemency Coggins' daughter, Krista. And Krista lives in Santa Fe now, but I met her first at Searoon. I was able to get out to Searoon during the early years of my interest in the book. She was packing up. She and her husband and two wonderful children were packing up to move to Santa Fe at that time. But I got to go out at Searoon and see where Anya lived and worked, and what the view was from her study. Those are remarkable things to be able to do when you are trying to get inside the head of a person you're writing about. And Krista and her family were so gracious. After they moved from Searoon and it was sold, of course it was torn down immediately. It is no longer there. But I got to see it as it was, and as Anya and her husband Chan built it. And then in that picture also are a wonderful friend of Pamela Forsey's, Julie Lee, who was with Pam often a visitor out at Sea Room when they lived in Manhattan, and told me many stories of her impressions. Also in this picture is Sandra Powers, a cousin of the family, the daughter of Gallatin Powers, a California girl who came to New York and often came out to see Anya after her divorce when she was living at Sea Room, and became a very important part of a group of younger people who in her later years, Anya enjoyed so much being part of the young set, and Sandra was one of those. So, and Zizi, as we know her, Clemency, is also in that picture. So there they are. They became my support system, and they feel like family to me. Okay, let's move on and take a look at the other family. This is Anya's family. Her father, Ernest, her mother, Grace, and her on the wonderful herringbone patterned outside porch at Wendigool. And there they are, the three of them, living at least part of each year out at Wendigool in Cascade, and spending their winter months in Manhattan. The next slide also shows Wendigool as Ernest Thompson Seton built this absolutely remarkable place. He was a writer, a naturalist, a wonderful artist, but his architectural and engineering skills, his landscaping skills created just a fantastic place. And as I think about place, I think that that is one of the things that absolutely drew me in to want to write about Anya Seton. When she was writing her first novel, My Theodosia, the first thing she did was head to South Carolina. And she always said, all my novels are absolutely grounded in place. And when she got an idea for a novel, the first thing she did with every single one of them was go find the place where her characters would live and thrive and grow and develop. So for me, going out to Wendigool with Susan Richardson, who was the librarian at the Greenwich Historical Society, on my first trip out there, it didn't look like this picture. It was in ruins, and no one knew at that time what was going to happen to Wendigool. Now it is, I think, a stunning, stunning place, the Pomeranz Park with a beautiful lake, all of the terraces that Ernest Thompson Seton arranged around the house, the huge, thick stone walls of this place that was a dream house for him. It announced not just a place and address, but it announced his family's place in the world. And I think it is where Anya became grounded in her ideas and her identity based on her relationship with her two parents and with this amazing place to grow up in. The next slide also shows us another picture of Wendigool when it had 3 stories. And then, of course, the other picture is one that I took when I was out at Greenwich not too long ago, of the remains of that house and the plaques that are there commemorating the building of Wendigool. And of course now available to everyone as a just lovely, beautiful, eye-striking, and also peaceful and almost spiritual former home of Anya Seton. Okay, next slide. I wanted to just give you quick looks at the other places that I went to very early on when I was beginning to think that I might be able to write this book. And this is a lodge that is connected to the house that Ernest Thompson Seton built when for some reason or other, Windyghoul no longer seemed to fit. It was out in Cos Cob. Grace and Ernest were interested in being closer into some of the still incredibly rural parts of Greenwich, but that gave them access to a little more of society. And so they built De Winton on Lake Drive. And this is the lodge that was built before the main house was ever finished. And I don't know if you can see very well, but Ernest Thompson Seton loved to, in his stucco Tudor style, sketch in certain drawings of and certain sayings and symbols that were important to him at that time, as of course the leader of the boys movement of woodcraft that he later became so associated with. And this lodge is full of those symbols and signs. The next slide, I think, will be showing us another picture of that lodge, which is now a full-time residence connected to the main house of De Winton. So let's take another look and see De Winton itself. This is De Winton, the second home that Ernest Thompson Seton built. I was very fortunate with Pam Forsey and also the folks who lived there at that time to be able to go into this amazing house that he built, again in what he called his Tudor Indian style, at least to a certain degree. It was a very fashionable place built for entertaining. But interestingly, if you read the book, you find out that the Seton family, including Anne Seton, as she was known then, hardly ever lived at De Winton. One more picture of De Winton and its grounds, if we can move on to the next slide, will show you the long driveway. And just as he had done at Windyghoul, Seton built lakes. And again, he was establishing his place in the world and his family's place in society through these houses. Let's go on and look at the next, because that we can move on from that quickly, but that's just an interesting picture to me of Anne and her fiance, who became her first husband, Hamilton Cottier. But as we go on, we see the house that we really associate with Anya, because when she came home from school, she came home to De Winton but very quickly, Ernest Thompson Seton had tired of De Winton and built the smaller little Pequot up on a rise behind De Winton, and that became known as Little Pequot. And that is the home that Anya Seton, then Anne Seton, lived in until she and Chan finally built their own home, her own first home, in 1951. So from when you think about that time, from before she was married in 1923, she didn't really have a home except the home her father built, which after he left the family, her mother Grace lived in for almost the rest of her life. The next slide also shows us another picture of Little Pequot. It was a very oddly angled house with lots of additions to it, but it was a wonderful home, not just for Anya and her second husband, Chan Chase, but for the three children that they had, Pamela and Seton from her first marriage, and Clemency from her marriage to Chan. So here is Little Pequot. Again, I was able to visit Little Pequot and get a sense of what the life of this family might have been there. Not a very prepossessing type of house, but the grounds and the gardens and the lake that those children and Anya and Chan had to enjoy. They did a tremendous amount of Greenwich entertaining there. Let's move on and we can, I think, maybe see, yes, that's another picture of Little Pequot. Let's go on quickly so we can take a look at some of the other places. This is the interior, the old interior of Little Pequot, with this huge open room that dominated the first floor of, and where the family must have been running in and out all the time. And Anya wrote her first novels here. And so it was an incredibly important place to her. Beyond that, let's look at the next slide. And we can see, I also went out when I was actually thinking I could write about the whole family to New Mexico, where Ernest Thompson Seton moved with his second wife and built what it was called Seton Castle. The picture on the left shows Seton Castle when I visited there. On the right is Ernest Thompson Seton himself, who didn't move out there until his 70s and built a lot of the place by hand. An inveterate home builder. And that's important to me because homes were so important to Anya Seton as well, something I think she got from her father. One more look at another slide, and we will see the tragedy that befell Seton Castle not long after I visited. Just like Searoom was torn down, Seton Castle burned when it was being renovated. And so it is no longer there. It kind of, the ruins look kind of like Wendigoal. And some of the same features are in both of these houses. So these are the places that grounded me as I started thinking about Anya's life and how she became a writer. Okay, let's move on now. The last house is the one where she, in her 1950s, in the 1950s, wrote the two major novels of her life and the last 5 novels of her life, and that was Searoom. This is an aerial view of Searoom, a remarkable place. I interviewed a neighbor, I guess on my first trip out there in the early 2000s, and he had been there a long time, and he said, anybody who builds a house with a flat roof is looking for trouble. but Anya and Chase built Searoom to fit the landscape, this incredible rocky area right on Long Island Sound, where Chan could have his boats, and Anya could look out over Long Island Sound and sometimes take a swim. And most of all, from her study, write the most important novels of her career. A couple more pictures of Searoom we'll take a look at very quickly. This is the interior, again, much wider and more open than Little Pequot, but just this kind of large family area that strikes you when you entered Searoom when you were there. And then another slide will show you a pen and ink sketch, which I like very much, of Searoom when it was expanded. Only 4 years after it was finished, the Chases found that it was not nearly big enough for their needs, and so they expanded it into what you can kind of get a view of. All right, so these are the places that I associate with Anya. 2 more that I of course need to mention. Oh yes, this is a wonderful picture, I think, of the Chases, and also it's a picture of Pamela and her mother, and Zizi or Clemency, and Chan Chase on the seawall overlooking Long Island Sound, with the house would be in front of them. So there is another family important to the place and the time and the life of Anya Seton. Okay, let's go on very quickly. This, of course, is what's known as Todd's Point or Greenwich Point, but for Anya, who loved this area of Old Greenwich, it was always going to be Elizabeth's Neck and always going to be associated with the Winthrop woman, Elizabeth Feek, who became the mother founder of Greenwich, Connecticut. And the last slide in this little group is a picture of Putnam Cemetery, where Anya is buried, where also her mother, Grace Gallatin Seton, are both buried under a beautiful tree. And that earlier picture of the whole group out there after Pam Forsey's death is this same area with those two larger monuments and other ashes of family members are also there at Putnam Cemetery. Okay, so that's the place. And what I want to talk about just a little bit before I open this for questions, which I'm going to do in about 5 minutes, has to do with the whole idea of the title of the book that I wrote, Anya Seton, of Writing Life. The writing part of that title, which was most important to me, and I actually had a little quarrel with my editors because I had always thought this book would be called Anya Seton, Writing a Life. And she wrote her life in 2 different ways. She wrote her life through journals. And the journals became the centerpiece of what I wanted to do with this book. Because while she was writing her novels, Anya was also writing about writing the novels in journals that she kept throughout her life. But beginning in 1930, she kept them in bound books with this handwriting. And each of those bound books was 300 pages long. And each of those books were written on every page, just like this. Beautiful handwriting. Thank goodness they taught good cursive when she was going to school, because you could read through and her writing is legible with almost never a spelling error, anything. And to read through those journals is to see her writing her life as she was living it and as she wanted herself to know it. The journals are self-doubting very often. They were a way for her to question the decisions she had to make. She was not nice to herself in them. She often talked about having been unkind to her husband or her children, but she also talked a great deal, and more as time went on, she talked about her writing and how she was writing and the way she saw herself as a writer. So those journals became the way I wanted to tell her story. I wanted to let her voice be the guide into what her life could be presented as to her readers today. So that was the one way in which she had a writing life. She wrote in those journals, not daily, but very frequently through all the years from 1930 till the last one we have, which ended in 1973. The other way, of course, that she wrote her life, and we can take a look at that in the next slide, is through the novels. She said at one point, "I suppose I write myself in all my heroines." And that was a very key statement for me to read. It came from her journals. All of her novels, from the one that is often considered her worst, Foxfire, to the much better known ones, contain autobiographical elements from her own life. Foxfire, which I thought too, just because everybody else said so, was her worst novel, was set in the 1930s, at the time she had married her second husband. And you can take a look at the relationship between the two lovers in Foxfire, and you can see a lot of the tumult that was going on in Anya's life in 1950 when she wrote that novel, but set it back in those years. But she also in that novel wrote about the Plains Indians of that era. And the hero of the novel is a very blustery but incredibly handsome man. And the bond that the two lovers have in this novel is primarily a sexual one. And that in some ways reflects the relationship that she had, especially in the early years with her husband, Chan. In other novels as well, we see Anya appearing in the imaginative, creative form that she could recreate herself and her characters. So I'm just going to show you a couple more ways in which that's the case, and then we're going to do questions. Katherine, her most famous novel, shows the story of this young woman who is completely overtaken, first by a very unhappy marriage, and then by a lover who is in many ways ideal. As Anya often saw men, her ideal man was a tall, powerful, good-looking authority figure, perhaps not unlike her father, but also a man who emotionally was always connected to Katherine. And of course, that was the great John of Gaunt. And Anya is looking at some of her own life there. And of course, another novel that closely reflects her own life, the next slide shows us, is the appearance of her mother, Grace Gallatin, whom she adored all her life, whom she lived with until 1951 with her own family. Grace Gallatin has a major appearance in the novel Green Darkness, where she becomes a very important mother figure. And as she's described in that novel, she looks exactly like this picture of Grace Gallatin Seton that you see here in a picture next to Anya. And the last, then I'll leave it us with that, of course, is the Winthrop woman. The Winthrop woman, of course, the novel is set in the place that Anya Seton loved most, Greenwich. And the figure of Elizabeth Feake Hallett is a woman who I think was Anya's ideal of the woman she would have loved to be, a home builder, a woman who was strong and who made her way in the world and never gave up and became a hero figure, especially to her family. And so all of these novels were a way that Anya had the life she wanted most was a writing life. And she often contrasted that. She said, there's a cleavage for me between real life and my writing life. And I don't think she ever resolved that cleavage. But when she was writing her life in her journals and in her novels, she became the woman whom I hope I was able to capture in the book that I wrote, Anya Seton, A Writing Life. So let's talk. Let me listen and hear what you all have to say. Can we have questions or chats or stories? I'm so eager to hear what you all think.
There is a question in the chat from Renata, and it's, is there any thought about publishing Anya's journals?
I have no idea. They would be fascinating to publish. I don't think it would be a great idea to publish them in their entirety, simply because a lot of them are simply full of the dailiness that was her life. But the decision on doing that would not be up to me. The journals are owned by her family, and that would be a decision that they would make. I tried to use it, and I picked the things that I really thought were most powerful, both about her writing and other amazing things that she wrote about. Her writing about how shattered she was, for instance, after her divorce is one of the most poignant and also most real descriptions of what any woman might feel facing a divorce of that kind. And so a lot of the journals are incredibly readable and I think would be interesting. Other questions?
So I do have a note from Arlene that she has a question. Arlene, I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to ask it rather than.
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
Lucinda, thank you so much for this. I can't wait to read your book, because what I missed tonight was everything was so much about place. And I
Yes.
was so, I mean, it was interesting, but I was so tired of hearing about houses and the rooms and all that. I wanted to know about Anya's feelings.
Yes,
Liv-
yes. And I understand that. And I
Living,
I was trying to
living.
ground myself for this presentation, but um, I and of course I tried to let Anya speak for herself um, in the book. But what comes through very, very strongly is a woman who was incredibly split in terms of her feelings in so many ways. Growing up, she was a very submissive child. She lived in the shadow of her parents. She was incredibly privileged, but she really had very little self-confidence. And when she saw her parents divorcing, the first thing she leapt into was marriage in order to have some stability, because it looked like neither one of her parents were going to be interested in her. And this is at the age of 18. That first marriage was such a disaster, with a man who had no interest in a sexual relationship at all. They did have 2 children. But when she finally met Chan Chase in 1930 and they married, she still lived in the house that her mother lived in, and almost until her death. And she, I don't think, had a sense of identity, except for the fact that every time you turned around in the journal, she was saying, I'm going to write, I can write, I'm going to make money, I'm going to do this, I'm going to be a successful writer. And so that writing life juxtaposed against a real life where the expectations for her were to be a good wife, a good mother, a good 1950s Donna Reed show type, created in her a split that never healed. And then, of course, resulted in more and more and more drinking, and then pills.
Yeah.
All through it, every time she sat down at her typewriter, she pulled herself out of abyss after abyss and became joyous, really, when she was writing. So
And
I hope I'm filling in the gap from
that's so what
from
we
the
wanted
earlier
to
part.
hear. That's so what we wanted to hear,
Good.
where this, all this emotion, all this turmoil or lack of identity or, worry about her parents or whatever. That's that I wanted to know, where did it all come from? So I'm sure it's all in your book. So.
Well, it is, and I hope you'll read it. But of course, let me add the other thing. The other piece of what gave her confidence and power and joy were her research endeavors. She would say again and again in her journals, I am not a great creative writer. I'm not a great stylist, but what I am is a great interpreter of fact. And
Wow.
for me, the damned facts, and she called them damned facts. She said, I cannot write a book that doesn't include and give great reverence to the facts. And she loved research because she could put herself into a different world from the one she lived in, and she could live in that world. She could inhabit that world by just mining every single fact she could find. And of course, I think that's what all her readers still find incredibly amazing about her, is that ability to take whatever she could find in old records, just remarkable things that she did and found and went looking for, and turn them into a life that she lived imaginatively in a way that makes those books live for all of us. So I really thank you so much for your
But
question.
isn't that like what we really, and readers and viewers have to know, that people do that she's not what we think she is? And
Right.
you said, I mean, that's the message tonight. If there's one message, that here's, this person with 3, 4, 5 books, but you just revealed so much about it. And I thank you, Lucinda, because I've never read The Winthrop Woman. So I will get to it. I write, so I have a lot of things I'm doing, but I will write, I will read that. Yeah, I'll read it in a different way now.
Well, good. And that's, and I think what I tried to do in the book was I talk about each novel as she wrote the book. And I try to tie the ways in which the world that she created through both facts and imagination were allowing her to transpose herself into her characters and into their worlds. So so I talk about that a lot. I talk about all 10 of those major novels and the 2 young adult ones, and about the way we find her life, not in any simplistic way. I hope, because she was a great writer but I think part of her power as a writer was her ability to put herself into these other worlds, both as an escape for herself and also as a validation of herself and also of the characters she were creating. She created more and more and more strong women as she went on up through Elizabeth Feek in The Winthrop Woman, who was the woman I think who most embodied what she wished she could be.
Mm. Wow.
So thank you. We have a couple questions coming in through the chat.
Okay.
Carla asks, can you talk about her relationship with her editors and publishers?
Yes, and I talk about a lot of that in the book. Houghton Mifflin picked her up when she had done nothing but a few romance stories. A friend of her husband's from Houghton Mifflin came out and they picked her up and they never dropped her. To me, what is most remarkable in some ways is that first novel, My Theodosia, she had barely just said to her husband, I think I might want to write about Theodosia Burr, when he called this friend of his and said, my wife is thinking of writing a novel. Out he comes, this friend and sales manager at Houghton Mifflin, and listens to her talk about what she wants to do. And before she had really even written a word, by December, he came out in September, by December she had a contract. And from then on, Houghton Mifflin, as many publishing companies did at that time, between the 1930s and the 1970s, the editors and the publishers had personal relationships. They were professional in many ways. She valued her editors and her publishers. The great disappointment of her writing life, I think, was that they were very happy to have her be a bestseller. They did not critique her as much as she wanted. She wanted more criticism before the books were published. She wanted to make them more literarily powerful so that the New York reviewers, who almost to a man, and they were men, panned her books whenever they could. She wanted to be better, and Houghton Mifflin they were good friends, and they shepherded her along and gave her a ton of emotional support, but they did not give her the kind of critiques that I think would have helped her make her novels better, as good as they are. But the one thing they were never able to do was make her leave the facts out. Some of them said, you just don't need all those facts. And she said, yes, I do. If it didn't happen, I'm not going to put it in. And if it did happen, it has to go in. And that was kind of the relationship she had with them.
Great. Looks like we have a conversation about Searoon, how it was spelled, where it was, and if she passed while living in that house.
Yes, and let me mention, Searoon was at the end of Binney Lane, right on the Sound. They built this flat-roofed modern house in an area that had nothing but grand mansions. And of course, when they tore it down in about the year 2000, they built another grand mansion on that property that takes up every foot of space. But Anya moved into that house as she was writing Katherine. And I guess one of the reasons I got caught up in the houses was she moved there in the 1950s. And I truly believe that Katherine and Winthrop Woman, her two greatest novels, in part were written out of her finally coming in to her own place, her own house, where she could design things. I mean, she had never even picked out her own furniture. Isn't that amazing? And to have that place and a place to write finally. She didn't have a real study till they expanded it in 1955 while she was working on The Winthrop Woman. But it was a remarkable house. Everybody loved coming there because it was so close to the water. And Chan had his big boats out on the Sound. And when there were hurricanes and things, they all loved to come stand in the windows and watch the waves come crashing in, because it had the best view of any house on Binney Lane. So that's where it was. It was a remarkable house and incredibly modern. One story ranging, lots of glass, funny hallways, style house, which did not fit old Greenwich in any way, shape, or form. Other questions?
Well, Mary shares that she says, I worked for Anya in her home in Old Greenwich while I was in college. Always nice to me and a dramatic lady who constantly amazed me.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. Wonderful to know. I wish I'd known you before I wrote this book, because getting insights into who she was, I depended on her journals a great deal and her personal reflections about herself. And of course, I had the stories that her family told and a few friends. She was shy, but she was also remarkably warm. This is the opinions that people had of her, as she also, to her own family, could be hypercritical, with expectations that no one could have filled. And she wanted to dominate the scene with her family. She made these incredible Christmas and New Year's and Thanksgiving celebrations that went on according to an incredible blueprint that everybody had to follow on every holiday. So she was not an easy woman, but to people who gave her any kind of opening, her first response to them, I think, was generosity and warmth and kindness, and also humor. She could be very, very funny.
Another question from Joseph. Did she receive any formal instruction in writing, or were her parents her primary influences? And where was her primary and secondary education?
Okay.
Follow up to that.
Her primary education was tutors and nannies. But when she was 9 years old, she was sent to Spence School in New York City, an amazing place, an incredibly liberal young woman's school that went on through high school. And she stayed at Spence until she graduated from high school, sometimes boarding there. But her parents took her out whenever they wanted to. They took her on trips to Europe. So she was in and out of school in a very interesting way. And when she was 9 years old and her mother wrote to the head of Spence School, a very liberal woman, she wanted to know if she could start taking foreign languages. And the woman wrote back and said, well, she needs a grounding in grammar first. But Grace wanted her to be studying foreign languages and geography at age 9. So and when she left Spence, she had no more formal education. Neither Grace nor Ernest Thompson Seton had any formal education beyond Grace. And Grace's mother divorced her husband out in California when Grace was 9 years old, and she had Grace pretty much privately tutored. And Ernest Thompson Seton, living in Canada with his family, had no formal education beyond regular kinds of public school beyond the age of about 15. And the way these people taught themselves was to read. They read everything. And I think that's how Anya learned to write. She didn't write like her mother or like her father, but she watched them write all the time. And she, from a very early age, read every book she could get her hands on. She took one fairly formal course in short story writing from a New Yorker named Thomas Uzzell, who actually wrote a very famous book on writing called Narrative Technique. But she did not get along with him, and he crushed her by writing, not to her, but to her husband, and telling her husband that she needed more work and that he should pay for her to take more writing classes. So that didn't work. So, I mean, these three people were largely self-taught, but I think they were a lot like Benjamin Franklin, who simply soaked in everything that was written around him and developed an incredible ear for the language. From her father, she learned to observe the world. That's what he taught her. She said that was one of his greatest lessons to her, was to tell her to watch the world around her. And her mother and her father were both just natural storytellers, so probably just sitting around with them as much as she did until they split and she married at age 19 was just giving her that incredible ear that I think so many great writers have.
Mary, I see you have your hand up. So would you like to ask a question or add?
Thank you. Thank you, Lucinda. I was 19 when I got a job working for, as we called her, Anya in those days. I know you say it a little bit differently, but that's what I remember. And I got
Anya.
yes,
Yeah.
and I got the job through Greenwich Hospital. It was
Aha.
a summer job that lasted for 3 summers. And I remember going to her house at 5 o'clock at night, and Anya would be sitting in front of her beautiful picture window with her cigarette and her martini.
Yes.
And she had a very, very dramatic voice and way of talking. And I was just a college kid at the time. And I remember her saying to me, "Darling, make me a sexy sauce for my fish." And I said, "Anya, I don't know how to make any sauce, let alone a sexy sauce for your fish." And she thought that was very funny. She was quite amused at that. But my job was simply to sort of pull her dinner together, which was just fish and vegetables and fruit. And then my job was to count while she did her exercises. So
Oh my
literally,
gracious.
I stood in her bedroom and counted as she very dramatically did these exercises.
Oh,
But
wow.
she was really interested in what was going on in society in 1969. She wanted to know if I had gone to Woodstock, what musical groups I liked. I remember her saying to me, "Have you ever smoked marijuana?" She was really interested in what young people were doing. And I learned a lot from her. She was always nice to me. She was always gracious to me. I didn't come to appreciate her the way she really was till I was much older. And I saw her, I think it was a lecture at Greenwich Hospital, Greenwich Library rather. And when I walked up, she said, "Hi, Mary. Any husbands, any babies?"
Oh,
And
wow.
I said,
Wow.
"No, Anya, not at all." But so she signed her book for me. But one thing that I'll always remember her saying in her very dramatic voice was, "Life is so tedious." And that was sort of her whole affect, you know, very, very dramatic, very creative, but very sensitive and always nice to me.
Well, her editor, Paul Brooks, who became very famous as an editor with Houghton Mifflin, and he wrote a memoir, and she was very lucky to get the amount of space she did in that memoir, because he wrote about other famous people, writers that he had worked with. But about Anya, he said she had something of the prima donna in her, but she was always very warm and also had a wonderful sense of humor. And I had a friend who worked for Houghton Mifflin when she was in the late 60s, and she said that Anya would sweep into the office, as though she were the grande dame. But in her journal, she wrote, well, I'm their prized, pampered pup, and I have to play the part. She knew what she was doing, and in some ways, I think she covered her shyness, and in some ways, some of her self-confidence, or lack of it, by putting on that role of the grande dame who found life tedious. I could just see her doing that. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you so much thank you, Mary. We do have some more questions in the chat from Susan. The question is, was she using mind-altering substances to remove inhibitions or to enhance her imagination?
She was a drinker. I know that she tried pot, and that there were people who came out to see Ruth who smoked pot. I don't think in her journal she shows very little interest in pot. The other drugs she took were those that, tragically, I think, in many ways, her doctors began prescribing her, really even in the 1940s. She took Thorazine, she took Valium, she took Ritalin, and some of the others, all through, this was the valley of the dolls. And she consulted doctors all the time because she had vertigo, serious bouts of vertigo, beginning really in the 1940s. She wrote 5 novels in the 1940s, and she was already having these symptoms, which she actually called psychosomatic. And she consulted psychiatrists and other doctors who routinely, knowing that she drank a great deal, and sometimes encouraging her to drink, would also, more and more as time went on, prescribe these kinds of drugs for her, which she didn't take drugs to enhance her imagination. And as a matter of fact, for most of her life, she did not drink when she was writing. Toward the end, she did. She wrote in her journal, I guess when she was working on probably Green Darkness, although maybe it was Avalon, she actually said, something new has happened to me. I'm getting so, I can't write unless I have a couple of vodkas. I mean, and she drank a lot from the time she was in her 40s forward. I mean, a lot. I don't know how she put it away the way she did and managed to write the way she did. And that's in the book, and it's the sad side of what she called her real life was, which made her writing even more central to her whole identity.
Thank you. Another question from the chat from Joseph. Can you discuss her involvement in the Greenwich community as an adult? Was she a visible, active member?
Oh, well, yes. She was very involved in Greenwich. And of course, she was mostly involved in the Greenwich Historical Society, which she upheld and supported all her life. Of course, she loved that, but she was very interested in all the doings of Greenwich, and paid attention to what was going on, and was well known in the community, and involved in, she was very interesting. She didn't join a church, but she was especially involved in several of the churches, including the Christian Science Church, and I think is it St. Saviour's at the moment? I can't remember, but that church was important to her. But she was also, of course, particularly involved in the social life, especially the social life of Old Greenwich, where she and the people she knew along that road, the Kitchells, the Binneys, the Hirschhorns, there were parties going on all the time, and she welcomed people. She was very, very welcoming to people who wanted to come see her and see the house and be part of that circle. But she knew everything that was going on in Greenwich, I think.
So, we have another personal experience in the chat from Pat. It says, when Cameo Theater performed The Winthrop Woman in 1990, the whole cast and director got to go meet her at Searoon. We were told to be sure to admire her cat. It was a lovely experience. When the tall, handsome young man who played Will Hallett was introduced to her, she said, "Oh my, Will," and kissed him. I played Elizabeth, that's Pat, and Anya had a pacemaker then and remained seated. So, another.
Yes, and that was not long before her death. You know, she suffered this massive stroke in 1981, and she had dreaded having a long, debilitating illness, and that's unfortunately what she had. And of course, she died in 1990. So that was not long before she died, and she was wheelchair bound for a lot of that time. Those last 9 years of her life. Others?
Well, if anyone does have any more questions, they're welcome to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand.
And I would love to hear from you all by email or any other way. Can I give them my email address?
You're welcome to do so, of course.
Okay, it's all small letters, and it's MacKetha. In other words, my last name without the N, MacKetha @gmail.com. And if you would like to write me, I will respond. I would love to hear more and know more. I'm kind of like Anya. She every book she wrote, she said, if I just had another year, I could have made it much better. And that's the way I feel about my book. But I'm just glad I was able to get it done as it is.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Blythe, for sharing that in the chat as well, Lucinda's email. We do have one more question. Is from Joseph. He's interested in hearing more about neighbor recollections from your early visits to Binney Lane.
Well, I only met the one neighbor, and I hardly want to say this. I believe it was a Kitchell that I met, a much older man. He's the one who made the comment about the flat roof. And but there were it's funny, I came to Greenwich and met a group of English teachers from Greenwich High School when I was a senior consultant for a radio play series called Scribbling Women. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting funded us to go put on workshops. These were radio plays written by American short story writers. And we came to Greenwich and had 3 wonderful days of workshops with the teachers there. And I got to know some of them. And as a matter of fact, 2 of them let me stay in their houses during a couple of summers after that. And so I got to live in Greenwich, and one of them was right in Old Greenwich, just a block away from Binney Lane. And so, of course, those folks knew a lot of the stories about Binney Lane, which was often called Cinny Lane. And of course, Chase married Hyla Kitchell, who lived at the other end of the lane, and was married to a Kitchell who was the son of some of the Bennies themselves. So, you know, it was a very important little street. And of course, it's had its share of other tragedies and gossip over all the years, and probably still does today. I don't know.
Krista says, thanks so much, Cindy. The book is fabulous.
Ah, hi, Krista. That's Anya's granddaughter. I'm so glad you're here. So I'm glad to know you're out there. Thank you.
So, and Renata says, it's been amazing. I can't wait to get your book.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you all hung with me tonight, and I hope to hear more from you. And I'm just grateful for this opportunity to share some of what I learned and what I know. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Lucinda. It's a wonderful look into a wonderful writer, but also a very multifaceted person. And we thank you so much for sharing your research and knowledge with us. And in the new book, I'm very excited. I've been hearing about it, so I'm glad it's out and we can all enjoy it.
Okay, thank you so much. Good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Good night.